Hello all, I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. My name is Kaylin, and today I want to talk to you all about compassion. More specifically, self-compassion, and how practicing it helps make each of us become better, more compassionate people. Let's see, how do I go next slide? Click. Whoa. In order to discuss self-compassion and how it benefits everyone, we must first discuss what compassion is. I want to first say that I am a Christian, and this, along with personal experience, has influenced how I view the topics of this course. I will do my best to present a holistic view, but I want to make viewers aware of my personal bias and existing worldview. According to the images found in the classroom on Moodle, compassion is a sympathetic, and I quote, sympathetic consciousness of others' distress, together with a desire to alleviate it, end quote, Compassion 2021. Another image that can be found on the Moodle homepage, or more specifically, Week 1, is the one that goes through the main difference between pity, sympathy, empathy, and compassion. This image from Matthew's 2017 shows the increasing engagement in relation to the suffering scene. Pity has the lowest level of engagement, and thus it is merely the acknowledgement of suffering. Sympathy, though having more engagement than pity, still does not address the pain, but merely is caring about the suffering. Empathy has even more engagement than pity and sympathy, but is not quite compassion. Empathy is feeling the suffering alongside someone. And finally, the highest level of engagement, compassion, in which this image is defined as wanting to relieve the suffering. I want to acknowledge that compassion is not always defined the same person to person. There are many things that can influence how someone views compassion, such as life experience, level of income, health, culture, age, century, and religions, as well as many other factors. Now that we have a general definition of what compassion is, we can define self-compassion. Self-compassion, like compassion, is acknowledging suffering and seeking to alleviate it. But the cool part is, we are doing this for ourselves. Early on in our semester, our professor, Jackie Justice, was walking us through a self-compassion exercise, and she pointed out something that has really stuck with me throughout the semester. And though I don't remember the words verbatim, the general idea was that we deserve to be cared for in the same way we care for others. This idea, along with the self-embracing exercises, helped me to personally acknowledge that I wasn't loving and taking care of myself like I would if I saw someone else in my place. As a general practice, I now try to look at myself as if though I was a friend of mine, and ask myself the question, what would I do if I saw anyone else in this position? By doing this, I am forcing myself to be a bit more compassionate to myself. But, at the end of the day, why does it matter? In our textbook, Compassion Concepts, Research, and Applications by Paul Gilbert, there is a ton of information about compassion and how it interacts with others and the self, and more importantly, why and why it matters. The best way I can think of walking everyone through this idea presented in this course is by covering the material based on what week it was presented. Each week has a different topic which offers great insight into compassion and the compassion itself. Most weeks can apply in almost any topic as compassion is extremely interconnected. So let's go ahead and take a look into each week. In week 1, we read 3 articles on a topic of compassion. The articles varied slightly. I'm sorry, I am so tired. The articles vary slightly. This can be seen in how compassion was approached, how humans need compassion at young ages, and the differences between compassion and empathy. One thing I found really interesting can be found in The Compassionate Self, or The Compassionate Species by Dr. Keltner. When discussing the major differences between children and young animals, Keltner noted that animals could sit on their own and did not fully depend on their mothers like babies do. This can be seen when Keltner stated, and quote, "Little baby chimpanzees eat by themselves. Human babies can't. Baby chimpanzees sit up." End quote. Keltner 2021. This is a clear indication that humans have to have compassion in order to support and raise their offspring. This is once again supported when Keltner stated, quote, "Our babies are the most vulnerable offspring on the face of Earth." And that simple fact changed everything. It rearranged our social structures, building cooperative networks of caretaking, and it rearranged our nervous systems. End quote. Keltner, 2012. Keltner is bringing up that humans especially must exercise compassion for society to work. That is why compassion is so important. Week 2 has to be one of the most important weeks I will cover in this presentation, as the topic of self-compassion is exactly what's covered. The goal of this week was to acknowledge that it is okay to be good to yourself, and that accepting who you are is healthy. And this week, we are asked to listen to the podcast from Kirsten Neff, on the greater good about the power of self-compassion. One thing that stood out to me from the podcast was the emphasis on humans being imperfect and how mindfulness is essential. Kristen Neff stated, quote, "You are not alone in your suffering. Everyone suffers." End quote. This is essential to the human experience. We have to remember that when you are hurting, someone else is too. She said that self-compassion was made up of 3 major components. Self-kindness is actively seeking ourselves with kindness and warmness. The second part is, quote, "Remembering imperfection is a part of the shared human experience." End quote. Neff 2012. The third part is mindfulness. Notice your suffering without becoming self-pitying. Next, in week 3, it's the first week that we dove into our textbook, Compassion Concepts, Research, and Applications by Paul Gilbert. We read chapter 1 and 2, and the reading mostly had to do with pro-social behavior and the definitions of compassion. In chapter 1, when discussing what compassion is, Paul Gilbert makes a really great point about intentions having an impact on compassion, and what motivates certain behaviors. He said, quote, "Compassion can represent a blend of emotions." End quote. Gilbert, page 6. This, though relatively brief, provides insight on how innately complex compassionate behavior can be. It is not always an easy or convenient path. In our group discussion, we talked about pro-social behavior and why it has stopped. Though the pandemic was used as an excuse, it actually amounts to so many more things in today's society. Some notable things that have contributed towards less pro-social behavior are the promotion of independence in ways such as not depending on others or building emotional boundaries that protect us from harm. This can even be seen as self-compassion in action. A possible reason some individuals might not act in compassion and support individualization is because the concern for their own safety. According to Gilbert, quote, "Past cruelty instills a certain fear and makes us somewhat more lacking in trust." End quote. Gilbert, page 17. Week 4 mainly focused on the Compassion Narrative Project, which was really beneficial for personal growth, but it doesn't get into a ton of information. It was also the first due date for an interview.
Just remembering, take a step back, and you can always come back to it, and you have people who, most of them care about you. And the way, the professor, after I got to know her, I'm like, yeah, she's great, she's understanding, knowing that my mom's there, that she's helping, so.
Yeah, probably just a little bit of gratefulness, just that everyone's around you as a support system. Yeah. Even if it doesn't feel like it when you're immediately overwhelmed, when you take a step back. Yep. It seems like what you're saying is when you take a step back, everything is much better than it seems.
Yes.
You just may need a moment, sip our tea, just take a little break and be okay. Which we also probably needed tea because they were sick last week and I was sick last week, so all of our voices are dead.
The clip you just saw was of Emma Van Est. Emma is a parapro, which is essentially a one-on-one teacher for students with special needs. but what I want to focus on is how she responds to compassion. Due to her job, she is to show a lot of compassion even when she is not getting it in return. When asked to tell me a memory about a time when she was shown compassion, she told me about a teacher that gave her extra time on an assignment. What she had to say was that receiving compassion was really great, and it made her want to be more compassionate. Week 5 was solely focused on Chapter 3, an evolutionary compassion. One thing I found particularly interesting was the discussion of what separates humans from animals. Though all the actual needs we have are similar to those of animals, we end up with an awareness. Paul Gilbert states, quote, "We are aware that we are aware, with a consciousness of our consciousness." End quote. Gilbert, page 32. This means that we have evolved our awareness enough to recognize that we are aware. This is what seems to be separating us from the animals. Awareness is closely tied to compassion. Awareness is closely tied to compassion, as awareness shows us the need of others. To be fully aware of another's needs and willingly ignore them would be utterly inhumane. Week 6 is all about the production Wit by Margaret Edson. In her play, we follow Vivian Baring, Ph.D., as she goes through cancer treatments for stage 4 or ovarian cancer. The play seeks to shed light on how patients should be treated better, especially when they are unable to help them cure an ailment. Better treatment does not mean that they are being treated poorly, rather that they are being treated as an experiment for the sake of others. Doctors may not have informed Baring in simple enough terms, information about her condition, thus isolating her further in her said condition. Quality of life did not matter to the doctors in charge of the research, but furthering medical knowledge did. The thing they wanted to achieve mattered, and their contributions were great, but the state of Vivian should have mattered more to them. After all, she is a person deserving of love and compassion. Being compassionate is essential to working in the medical field, especially because people receiving the care are dealing with far more than their physical condition, and even more so in the case of cancer. Week 7's theme is nature, nurture, and altruism. In Week 7, we read chapters 10 and 11 in our textbook. Humans are dynamic systems. Quote, "Humans are dynamic systems who are born with many psycho-biosocial propensities that are shaped by experience after birth. Humans come from a tree of life where emotion systems are ancient. Capacities to deliberate and to think linearly are recent developments in the tree of life." End quote. Gilbert, page 175. What Gilbert is saying is that humans are all born with a sort of default settings, and as we grow and learn, we adjust these settings to fit within our units of society. A lot of what we are set into life with ends up adapting a bit more to our surroundings and the thoughts of our own areas. In Chapter 11, Gilbert discusses how caregivers impart their compassionate characteristics into a child. This can go as far as those who did not receive much compassion not being able to react to it so much in the future. Quote, Studies assessing global self-report, measures of prosocial virtues, and tendencies have consistently found that the higher attachment-related avoidance is associated with less empathetic concern, less inclination to take the perspective of a distressed person, and less ability to share another person's feelings. End quote. Gilbert, page 195. Week 8 was the art analysis project and the second interview. In this interview, I spoke to my fiancé, Noah Van Est. When asked if compassion is important, his response was pretty interesting.
I can't be definitive on it.
Maybe parts of compassion are important, but others are not so great, or what do you mean by that?
So, like I said earlier, the way I view it, sometimes, like, when I think of compassion, I think if I was shown compassion in certain ways, I would be horrible. I needed strictness. It's just personal. I needed a lot of structure.
Do you think that maybe someone providing you structure could be compassion?
And yeah, that's how I think of my mom having... Yeah, I guess that is a...
It's a form. Everyone's
It's a
individual.
form. It's not a common form. That's where I respect her for it, is it's something where even I have a difficulty with illustrating compassion the same way she has. And she did it, I think she learned it from marrying my father, who needed structure. And she learned to show compassion in a way that is very organized. She's very leader type. Like, can lead just about anybody and create a structure out of nothing.
Noah's response is especially interesting because his interpretation of compassion implies that it has to be giving someone something in the first place. Once we dug a little deeper, he obviously realized that compassion can be different for different people, but the misunderstandings about compassion I have heard a few times over the course of my interviews. Compassion in the mind was the topic of week 9. This week, we were asked to read a few chapters from section 2 of our textbook. Though there are many interesting concepts throughout this week's reading, I ended up taking a special interest in chapter 6. In chapter 6, there is a really interesting conversation about the role of compassion in parenting, or, even more specifically, the role of oxytocin in bonding between a parent and a baby. In brief, oxytocin plays a really important role in caregiving, as it helps with being a motivator to do a task. This information is from Kaylin et al. In Studies of Compassion, page 105. For mothers, the oxytocin actually was produced from merely gazing at the child. Kaylin et al. Studies of Compassion, page 105. This is really amazing, as oxytocin is essentially a compassion hormone, and becoming active from merely looking at a baby allows the mother to better serve the needs of the child. Chapter 6 goes on to suggest that oxytocin is one of the most important hormones for caregiving, stating, quote, "Mother-infant behavioral synchrony has been found to correlate positively with maternal salivary and plasma oxytocin levels." End quote. Kaylin et al. Studies in Compassion, page 105. This essentially means that when mama and baby are working together, there is likely high levels of oxytocin in on their saliva. At first glance, I glossed over this little bit of information as it seems pretty insignificant. But after thinking about it, it makes a lot of sense. Oxytocin is present when things are working right in parents, and parenting is one of the most compassionate jobs there are. Week 10 had to be one of the most fascinating weeks of the semester. In a lot of ways, I had never even considered how compassionate behavior may look different in different societies. This week, we were tasked with reading 2 articles, at least, from this week's assigned readings that talked about compassion in different cultures. Something really fascinating about compassion is that it is not universally shown in the same ways. Culture deeply impacts compassion, which can, at least for me, alter how we view compassion. When we started this class, compassion was pretty black and white to me. Though compassion itself is universal, how it is displayed is anything but universal. And that was made exceedingly clear in the article I read, titled "The Cultural Shaping of Compassion." by Birgit Hoopman-Holm and Jalen Tsai Hoopman-Holm and Tsai were discussing how culture directly shapes compassion, or really the idea of compassion is reshaped by cultural values. Hoopman-Holm et al., 2017, page 274. In the West, compassion is shared with those who... Sorry, I am all tongue-tied. In the West, compassion is shared with those who we recognize certain things about or understand their point of view. Hoopman-Holm et al., 2017, page 275. This differs from Buddhists, who see everything as one system of life, which allows them to feel compassion on all sides of situations. They put it best when they said, quote, "Our findings suggest chat compassion is expressed differently depending on the degree which people want to avoid feeling negative emotions." End quote. Koopman-Holm et al., 2017, page 282. Though it sounds very American of me, I hadn't really considered how compassion may not mean the same thing in different cultures. In my interviews, I had come up that compassion is different person to person, but I had not thought of it as anything other than falling slightly differently than on my own views, on a universal spectrum of compassion. Though compassion is universal, it may not be quite as binary as I initially thought. Next up, we have an interview with Jennifer Schwarzkopf. When I ask her what she thinks about compassion, she says,
"If so, why?"
I do think compassion is tremendously important. It's just part of goodness. As a Christian, I think it's reflective of the Holy Spirit working in us. Giving others grace when they don't deserve it is one of the highest, to me, forms of compassion. I don't get to play judge and jury. I don't know their story. I don't know what they've been through. And that's not my place to judge. My place is to love. Doesn't mean, and I think you're right, when we talk about boundaries, there's a difference between being a floor mat and having grace, and asking God for that wisdom and discernment in how to create a healthy boundary while still loving others is probably key. And you show love by serving too.
Yes.
Like, huge. And that's another form of compassion. So just loving others and remembering, gosh, if that was me, how would I want someone to treat me?
Something really interesting about my interview with Jennifer is that she seemed to break down compassion as more of a thought process rather than an action system. So, in her mind, grace would be the same as showing compassion, when in reality, compassion may be more of showing an action. And boundaries don't really have a lot to do with compassion towards others, they have a lot to do with self-compassion. So, though I don't agree with everything that was said, overall it was really insightful to see just how differently people view compassion. Next, I had an interview with Denise Elder. Denise is a therapist as well as a preschool teacher, as well as a mother. Her views on self-compassion were especially helpful. Self-compassion and not wearing ourselves out.
That's a good question. I think just years of practice and understanding that, especially with therapy, I want to be present in the moment with that client, and even with my kids in the class, and sometimes it takes some processing after the fact, if it's counseling with one of my coworkers, if it's like a really hard conversation or something, or with my students. My mom is a teacher, so I'll usually call her and be like, "Mom, you're not going to believe this," and she's like, "Oh, I do believe that." And I think I really try to be mentally aware of taking those steps to kind of decompress and just really not shying away from those emotions that maybe even get triggered for me, and recognizing that.
Okay. Would you say that you taking that time to decompress would even be self-compassion?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I would say so, for sure. Especially in some situations, when there's really difficult conversations or topics that are brought up, it can, because they can be, they can be really heavy.
Okay,
So.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The conversation with Denise was especially applicable as self-compassion is the main topic of this thing. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that decompression and allowing ourselves to recover between interactions is a really important part of self-compassion. If our cup is empty, how are we supposed to take care of others? So everything we've looked at so far brings me to my before and afters, which are kind of my takes on who I was before and now after the end of the semester. Before this class, my understanding of compassion was very binary. There was right and wrong, good and bad. Compassion wasn't so much a spectrum, but maybe like a slight range. Now I understand that compassion is far more widespread. It's a lot more unique to people and groups of people specifically. So like within China especially, compassion there is way different, especially with the family units being much different than those in America. So though compassion is universal, it is also profoundly personal and unique, which is really honestly quite amazing. Let's see, click. Okay, I just want to go over all the interviews and some trends I noticed. I noticed the trend of general kindness and trying to sum up ideas, even if they weren't actually full ideas, if that makes sense. And I think the reason behind that is people just want to sound like their thoughts are thought through. Though a lot of the people contradicted themselves in their own answer, which led to even more confusion on my end. So as far as trends go, I interviewed some individuals who don't think the same way as I do, and some that work with children and people with special needs. And this is also kind of skewed the trends I saw because the people I were with were primarily very in tune with compassion, or they just had an understanding of compassion that was very different to my own. So maybe there's some trends that I didn't notice, but what I noticed were those few things. As far as my ending thoughts, I've learned a lot, and I don't really know where I stand on a lot of things right now. Part of me learning was learning to let go of some ideas, and that's left me with kind of a state of confusion about where I stand on some things now. So I'm just kind of trying to figure it out as I go at this point. And that would be my final thoughts on this. So compassion is such a universal thing that I had never thought of it as complex as it is. These are the links. One sec. Okay, now that you can actually see the ends of the links, these are the links I use. I'm giving these just in case anything didn't get put correctly into the works cited, so that we can still find things even if something went wrong, because the last thing I want to do is steal information. Oh, no, that is not what I wanted to click. I'm sorry. Okay, click that. And then there is my works cited, maybe? There is my works cited. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening. Good luck.